Hi, and today we're going to cover Chapter 3, Doing Business in Global Markets. Although I think you'll notice that from most of our other lectures, it's really impossible to escape globalization in the business climate today. Follow along with this lecture in your book, and if I talk about it, highlight the concept, come back, take notes on that. These will be test concepts, I promise. First, we'll basically talk about importing and exporting. We all know about importing and exporting. Importing is when a country brings goods from outside of its borders into the country. Exporting is exactly the opposite. It's when a country sends goods to another country. When we think about trade, we think about the goods, but it's not just goods. Things that are also traded, for better or worse, are art, sports, cultural events, medical advances, and I put in parentheses there, countries today, we share diseases too. Space exploration and labor are also things that are traded. A personal example of my studio that I run for pets, photography for pets. I do a lot of importing. I buy a lot of stuff over eBay, and I'll import a lot of stuff direct from Hong Kong or China, and it saves me a bundle. It takes a long time, but these are things that all businesses in this day and age are looking at. It's how to keep the costs lower, and I can do that by importing goods directly from the manufacturers. Free trade is the movement of goods and services without political or economic barriers. Free trade opens huge markets. It creates a flow of production, however, to low-wage global markets. In other words, if U.S. manufacturers want to make T-shirts, for example, we need to pay minimum wage. There's probably benefits involved. There's taxes involved on employment. And so it makes the United States not a very favorable place for production these days. And so what we've seen is that a huge flow of production has gone to the low-wage global markets. And that is a consequence of free trade. However, free trade does inspire innovation, and it keeps companies competitively challenged. And what that means, first of all, it inspires innovation because if you don't know what the Japanese are going to come out with, then as a business owner, you need to be constantly on your feet, and you can't fall asleep at the wheel, and that competitive challenge that's always looming out there is something that it definitely keeps businesses on edge, and it keeps them fine-tuned. And I think it's a good thing. Free trade also helps keep inflation down by lowering the cost of goods. If the T-shirts, going back to the T-shirt example, if it was produced in the USA and they had to pay minimum wage and benefits and medical health care for their employees and whatnot, the T-shirt might end up costing the business, let's say, $5. But if they use the global markets, they can manufacture those T-shirts in a place where there's not employment taxes and they don't have to pay health care and those kind of things, and they might be able to make the T-shirt for $2. So if a business is faced with making a T-shirt for $2 or making it for $5, they're going to make it for $2. And from the consumer's perspective, that's going to lower the sale price of the goods. And so the consumers win by helping keep it helps keep inflation in check for the consumers by keeping the cost of goods down. There's a very important concept that I want you to know about: comparative advantage theory. Commit this one to memory. I mean, you will see this again. Okay, comparative advantage is is the notion that countries should sell to other countries those products it produces most efficiently and effectively. And buy, that should say buy, not but, buy from other countries those goods it cannot produce effectively or efficiently. An example, bananas won't grow too well in Canada. So if you're a Canadian firm, you probably should stay away from banana manufacturing, banana farming, because it's not going to pan out for you when there's other nations that are in tropical areas like Asia and Central America where bananas are like weeds and they're all over the place. So yeah, just stay away from bananas. But at the same time, if you're in a tropical climate, goods that would be manufactured in Canada, and I can't really think of one off the top of my head because when I think of Canada, I just think of snow. But anyway, here's another example. Cotton, right? Cotton loves to grow in the U.S. We have so many regions in our climate that are favorable for cotton production. As a result, the U.S. is the world's largest producer of cotton. So there's a comparative advantage. Now, there's another concept called absolute advantage. An absolute advantage is when one country is the sole source for a good or service. I don't think absolute advantage really truly exists anymore. There used to be an absolute advantage with South Africa and diamonds, but that's not the case anymore because they have found other sources of diamonds in Russia, and I mean, just there's lots of other places now, and they also synthetically make diamonds. So the absolute advantage that once existed for South Africa with diamonds is no longer there. But anyway, it's an important concept that I want you to know about. Let's take a deeper look at this comparative advantage. Let's look at an example of comparative advantage. And note down at the bottom, there's a bold statement down there that says expect to see this on the exam. And yeah, you'll see the part at the top here, the before specialization. Okay, and before specialization, so we've got two entities here, Alaska and Brazil. So in Alaska, if they work 4 hours, they can produce 5 pounds of salmon. Likewise, if they work 4 hours, they can produce 1 pound of coffee. In Brazil, if they work 4 hours, they can produce 1 pound of salmon, and in 4 hours, they can produce 5 pounds of coffee. Well, it pays for both of those nations, I mean, Alaska's not a nation, but it pays for both of those entities to specialize in what they have an advantage producing. Here's the example. In Alaska, if they work 8 hours and produce just salmon, they can trade those extra 5 pounds of salmon to Brazil for coffee. And they can consume 5 pounds of salmon and 5 pounds of coffee. Or they'll have 5 pounds of salmon and 5 pounds of coffee available for consumption in their market. Likewise, in Brazil, if they just specialize and they spend 8 hours producing coffee, they can produce 10 pounds of coffee. So what that would mean is they can trade those extra pounds of coffee and get 5 pounds of coffee and 5 pounds of salmon for the same amount of labor hours worked. So both come out ahead. The Alaskans get to have more coffee, and the Brazilians get to have more salmon. Exporting. Just about anything can be exported. And the text talks about lots of examples of exporting snowplows to Saudi Arabia because you can plow sand with it, and Saudi Arabians don't need to plow snow, but they certainly need to plow sand. And, you know, here's Samuel Adams in Germany, which Germany happens to be the home of so many awesome beers, but yet Samuel Adams does well in Germany. The Meridian Group is a business that exports special pool filter sand to Saudi Arabia. So now here's another firm that's exporting sand to Saudi Arabia. That's almost unthinkable. You wouldn't imagine that there's a market for sand in Saudi Arabia, but there is. So the bottom line is just about anything could be exported. And when you talk about exporting and importing, there comes the concept of balance of trade. Remember, terms in bold are things that you should definitely be aware of. A trade surplus is also known as a favorable balance of trade. And that simply means you're trading out more stuff than you're buying in. So you're exporting more than you're importing. A trade deficit, also known as an unfavorable balance of trade, is when the reverse is true. It's when you're not exporting that much, but you're importing a whole lot. And the deficit is where the U.S. operates on a pretty normal basis. Okay, so then there's this concept called dumping that's related to trade. And dumping is when a foreign company sells goods in a market below the price charged in the producing country. So in other words, couple bullets down, I've got China, Brazil, and Russia have been accused of dumping steel in the U.S. In other words, they sold the steel for less in the U.S. than they would in China, Brazil, or Russia. And why would you do this? Because number one, it reduces surpluses. So if Brazil had, and I still find it hard to imagine like that China must have been dumping steel years and years and years ago. I don't know when they were. I can't imagine China having an surplus of steel because I was just there. And actually, you'll notice that no steel or iron products are usually made in China. They're usually made in India. Okay, because China is expanding so fast and they're growing. And their construction is just going berserk over there. And they need every ounce of steel and iron that they have access to. So I can't wrap around the China thing, but the Brazil and Russia, okay, they would be able to reduce surpluses of steel by selling it in the U.S. Also, they could gain a new foothold in the market. So let's say a Russian steel company wanted to establish a presence in the U.S. Well, how they could do that is they could come into the U.S. and sell things below cost or below what their country's market value would be. And the result would be they'd get access to a whole bunch of new customers that didn't used to purchase steel from this Russian company that now are purchasing steel from this Russian company. And so it's a good way to gain a foothold in a new market. However, the U.S. now has laws to protect against dumping so that nations cannot come in and just undercut the U.S. businesses by dumping products in our market. So if they can't enter the market by dumping products, there's other ways that you can enter foreign markets. And these are listed in order of increasing risk and profit potential. So licensing has the least risk and the lowest profit potential. Foreign direct investment has the most risk and the most profit potential. Now, as far as this class goes, we're not going to dive too deep into most of these concepts, although I want you to be aware of all these different ways that you can enter foreign markets. And I will hold you responsible for knowing the different ways that you can enter a foreign market. And this list, you'll see it again. Okay? Licensing, exporting, franchising, contract manufacturing, international joint ventures and strategic alliances, and foreign direct investment. But the ones that we're going to talk about specifically are licensing and franchising, because we see licensing and franchising not just abroad, but we see those inside the U.S. as well. And so I'm going to focus on licensing and franchising. So let's take a look at licensing as a way to enter a foreign market, knowing that you can also license within the United States. Okay, so for licensing, a company charges another firm, the licensee, a fee, and it's called a royalty, in exchange for the right to produce the product or use its trademark. A fantastic example comes to mind: Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is a worldwide licensor, and probably the largest. The benefits of licensing is that it costs little to no money to produce or market the product themselves. And I'm going to put an asterisk there. In most cases. In the case of Coca-Cola, though, they do invest in marketing the product overseas. And so they do, and they do that mostly because they wanted to, infectiously spread the brand, so that other countries would in turn want to license it. And it now, it paid off, because Coca-Cola is probably, I think it is in every country. I mean, I've seen Coca-Cola in every country I've ever been to, and it's ubiquitous. And you just say, I just want a Coke. And you can say that to, somebody who speaks Hindi or Arabic or, just whatever. And Coke. You could just walk into a cafe and say, I want a Coke. And they know what you mean. So anyway, Coca-Cola did invest money in marketing the product in those markets because it wanted more countries and more firms to license the brand. Now, here's the catch, though. If the product is a smash hit, the bulk of the profit belongs to the licensee, which is the firm who buys the rights to use Coca-Cola's trademark. The only thing Coca-Cola gets from marketing their product in another market where it's being licensed, the only thing Coca-Cola gets is the probability that another market might also pick up their product. So that's where, but licensing, if it's a smash hit, the bulk of the profit belongs to the licensee. Another concept is franchising. Franchising is when someone with a good idea sells the rights to use the idea to sell a product or service in a given territory in a specified manner. And I have specified manner there in italics, because I think that's truly the key. See, the specification that they provide can include, you must use these wrappers, which we will sell you. And you have to use this ingredient of ketchup, which we will sell you. And so what ends up happening is franchising, all of the franchise stores become dependent on that someone with a good idea, that business who has the good idea, because the specified manner is extremely specific, and you have to get, all of your materials have to come from McDonald's, or they all have to come from Yum Brands, or they all have to come from Subway. And so as a franchisee, you have little to no flexibility to get anything from anybody other than the company with whom you have the franchise agreement. Major U.S. franchisors include Yum Brands, which I mentioned that's KFC and Pizza Hut. Subway, Holiday Inn, Dunkin' Donuts, and McDonald's. Of course, McDonald's makes the list. They are the hugest food service company in the world, with 31,000 stores in 119 countries. That's pretty amazing. Franchisors, however, must adapt their businesses to meet the local market. to meet the demands of the local market. So, like in the book they talk about Pizza Hut, Yum Brands, that they had to figure out that the Domino's pizza with squid and sweet mayonnaise is something that's preferred in, where did they say it, Japan. And, that's the thing, though. The franchisor has to figure out. They also talked about, where did they talk about? I lost my place in the book. But they talked about how when one of the companies entered into Hong Kong, they discovered that people like to eat chicken in the morning, or they like to eat hamburgers in the morning. It might have been McDonald's. That they like to eat hamburgers in the morning, and that they like chicken for lunch and dinner. And so this is the responsibility of the franchisor, must adapt their business to meet the local market, because they have to provide the specified manner that I mentioned above. So they have to say, you're going to sell this many chicken sandwiches, and this is how you make a chicken sandwich, and this is what's in it, and this is the ingredients, and by the way, here's your order form for the ingredients. But the franchisor is responsible for making that specified manner meet the local market. Let's take a look at some of the forces affecting trading in global markets. First is sociocultural. There's economic, which for whatever reason PowerPoint doesn't like sociocultural, so it looks like it's a spelling error. There's economic and financial, legal and regulatory, and physical and environmental. We're going to examine each of these now in more detail. First, we'll start with sociocultural. This, by the way, the book 72 and 73 is just chock full of good sociocultural examples. Okay, culture basically is a set of values, beliefs, rules, and institutions held by a specific group of people. Now, despite our diverse country, Americans are quite ethnocentric. An example, I was in Thailand, and I was visiting the Royal Palace, or it was one of the temples in Bangkok, and it was on New Year's Day, which is extremely, very religious. It's actually a very religious time. They do a lot of different religious ceremonies around that time of the year, and they were speaking. I was a tourist, obviously, and I was there with just thousands of other people, and I would say that the vast majority of the people that were there were Thai. And they weren't American, and they were yelling something into a megaphone. And I heard a student from a high school, probably, who was quite far away from me, but I heard him scream at the top of his lungs, "Well, we'd understand what you were saying if you would just talk in English." And I immediately thought to myself, stupid American. That is the perception that the whole world has of Americans, that the entire world needs to serve us, and that we do have a chip on our shoulder, and it really showed in that situation, because here we were in their space on their day, and he's insisting that they need to serve him by speaking his language, not the other way around. I mean, anyway, that's just an example. But we are quite ethnocentric as Americans. As businesses, you also have to deal with weights and measures if you're going to be selling things abroad. And guess what? Check this out. Liberia, Myanmar, and the U.S. are the only countries in the world who don't use metric. Think about that for a second. Here's Myanmar is like in a state of, military rule. And we've got Liberia, who's just Liberia, and the U.S. And we're the only countries in the whole Rest of the world uses metric. Can we say stubborn? But anyway, these are things that you're going to need to deal with if you are going and taking your business abroad. They won't tolerate that if you don't have metric measures. They won't tolerate it. People won't know. They won't know what a foot means. They only use yards. Or no, see, look, this is my own American brain here. They don't use yards. They use meters. And they don't use feet. They use meters. So anyway, that's the thing about it, is if you're going to be international, you have to think in terms of socio-cultural, and one of those socio-cultural elements is weights and measures. Here's a funny one, PepsiCo. And there's a bunch of these in a yellow box at the bottom of 73, but they attempted a Chinese translation of "Come Alive, you're in the Pepsi generation." And when they ran the ad in Chinese, it read to those customers as, "Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the dead." Whoops. Somebody needs to hire them a translator. But there's a lot of things that happen like that. A lot of snafus where we assume that what we say and how we say it translates into other languages, and a lot of times it doesn't. So anyway, look at it, 72 and 73, and box number 3.6. And you'll see a lot of other examples of what I'm talking about. Economic and financial. Firms need to adapt to foreign markets. The book gives, in Haiti, an example that in Haiti people buy gum by the stick. It's considered like a luxury item, and not a lot of people are very wealthy there, and so you buy gum by the stick, not by the pack. And so they need to adapt to that. And I've experienced it in India. I've seen this where people will buy single cigarettes from vendors. And so it's kind of like firms need to be able to adapt to these foreign markets and to repackage things or to approach from a different perspective. Some of the other economic and financial things that firms run into all of the time is the exchange rate of currency. The value of currency floats according to supply and demand on the global market. So that's why if you look at currency conversion tools, it's always changing. It's always up, it's down, and companies that operate in multiple countries, their costs can change as the currencies fluctuate relative to each other. So if they're paying somebody, let's say, $10,000 American US dollars per year, if the currencies are fluctuating and the dollar loses, let's say, 25% of its value, then all of a sudden that employee that was costing $10,000 is now actually costing $12,500. But in terms of what that employee is seeing, that employee is still seeing $10,000. But it's actually costing the company quite a bit more than that because of the floating currency values. And you can just imagine that that's a small example with one person. I mean, if you had multinational companies like General Electric who are operating in so many different economic zones, have employees all over the world, and you can imagine that their costs are going to fluctuate quite a bit as the currency exchange rates float around. There's the legal and regulatory environments. See, no central system of laws exists worldwide. And the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act prohibits American companies from making questionable payments to foreign officials to secure contracts. Consequently, this type of payment is very common in Asia, and it's quite very common in a lot of countries, but I experienced it firsthand in Cambodia and Vietnam, to some degree in Thailand, where these payments are basically bribes to the government officials, and That's pretty much a normal way things run. I put a link here to Transparency International, and I'm going to click that link. But first I'm going to need to pause my video, and I'm going to resize my screen because I've got it real tiny here so I can see the notes in PowerPoint as I'm giving this lecture. But I'm going to click, so bear with me, I'll be right back. Okay, well, apparently once you begin recording a video in Camtasia, which is the screen recording software that I'm using, once you start recording, and apparently you can't change the size of the video window. Okay, which is okay, because what we're still going to do is we're going to take a look at Transparency International's interactive look at the 2011 Corruptions Perception Index. And what Transparency International does is it measures what the perceptions are among people in various countries about the status of corruption in their respective countries. And so I'm going to resize to try to get like as much real estate as I can here. I'm going to need to move this screen around because I've got it set to exactly the size of my PowerPoint, which is, I think, unfortunately not going to work too well. But if I move this over here and squeeze this out right there, okay, I think we've got most of what we need to see here. And what we're looking at is there's different color codes for very clean to highly corrupt. And I think it will surprise you that among the 6 nations that are the cleanest, New Zealand, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Singapore, and Norway, the second group you can see there. And now we're still in a pretty clean zone, but we're getting down there. And there's the United States. Let me see if I can't move off of this. But the United States comes in at a 7.1 on a 10-point scale. Pretty amazing to think about that. I think a lot of Americans think we're, squeaky clean. But the reality is there's a lot of political special interests in our country that, well, they have an awful lot of influence on things that go on in our country. So anyway, sorry if it's a rude awakening to anyone, but the United States is not one of the cleanest countries as far as corruption is concerned. But yeah, as you go down, look at this. As you go down, the countries are getting increasingly more corrupt. And look at that giant 60 that we're heading toward. There's 60 nations who fit into this category of from 2.9 to 2. And then there's 12 that are even below that, 1.9 to 1. And so that gives you an idea of where, where the corruption is. And it's quite widespread. And I think there's another one too. If I can go to, I think this one is the map that I just clicked on. Yeah, this one is the map. And it looks like, I don't know if I can squeeze it a little bit. Yeah, to make it fit. Well, not exactly, alright. But this gives you an idea of what it is, what it looks like on a world map. Remember, red, the deeper the shade of red, the more corrupt. So as you can see, the world is it's a pretty corrupt place, really. Unless you happen to be up here in Sweden and Finland, or way down over here in New Zealand. Those are some of the cleanest. Norway, Sweden, and Finland are some of the most non-corrupt places. But anyway, yeah, just take a look at this map, and it might surprise you when you hover on, like Canada is an 8.7, and the United States is a 7.1. So actually, taken in context, the U.S. is more corrupt than Canada. It's pretty crazy to think about that. But anyway, so let's go back to our PowerPoint. Back to what I was saying, no central system of laws exists worldwide. So if you're a business and you're looking at entering foreign markets, you're going to need to keep those legal and regulatory things in mind. And then comes the last is the physical and environmental. Some developing countries have primitive infrastructure. Perfect example. I studied in Cambodia twice. And I'll tell you, if you want to manufacture something in Cambodia, you need to generate 25% of your required electric power and install roads. I visited a garment factory that was run by Target, and they do just that. It's a huge warehouse. It makes Circo brand children's clothes at that factory. And yeah, so you have to, if you're a manufacturer and you want to manufacture in Cambodia and take advantage of the low wage markets over there, or the low wage employment markets, well, you need to get into the electric business and you need to get into the infrastructure business, because you need to put in roads and you need to put in electric. And I'll bet that there's some requirements as far as water goes too, because I know there's a lot of pretty sketchy water in Cambodia. So if you need to use water in your manufacturing process, or I mean just for the health of your workers and the people that Target sends to the country to work, there's going to be some water requirements as well. So anyway, that all has to be taken into account. Also, with the physical environmental, technology can differ. Access to the internet can be problematic, and I didn't put a bullet on here for the environmental piece, but it goes sort of, I guess, hand in hand. It's kind of in between regulatory and environmental, but there can be different environmental regulations in one country versus another, and that makes a big difference if you're looking for a place to locate your business. Trade protectionism. So let's talk a little bit about this concept of, so as the world is trading with one another, sometimes they don't want foreign goods entering their market for whatever reason, and so there's ways that they can protect their trade. Tariff is a tax on imports. It makes them more expensive to buy. There's two types of tariffs. It's a protective tariff, and that one does just like what it says. It raises the price so that domestic firms can compete. It protects the domestic firms. Then there is a revenue tariff, and revenue tariffs raise money for the government. It has nothing to do with protection. It's all about revenue on that kind of a tariff. Another way that you can protect your trade is to issue a quota, and a quota limits the quantity that can be imported. The U.S., for example, has quotas on sugar and shrimp, and that is to protect U.S. producers. Countries can use an embargo against another nation, and that's a complete ban on the import or export of a product. And it can even halt trade between nations altogether. An example, the U.S. has had a trade embargo with Cuba since 1962. So we haven't traded anything with Cuba since 1962. There are also ways that countries can protect their markets with non-tariffs. The book gives the example of the Japanese keiretsu, and I think I just probably smashed that. But it's keiretsu was, the Japanese said, "Oh sure, come on in. You can import anything you want. No taxes, no tariffs, no quota. Just come on in." But what they forgot to mention is that all of their businesses, their local industries and suppliers, and even the customers, were kind of in this lifelong relationship with each other. And it would be like a violation of that relationship to do business with another country. So in came the U.S. and all these companies trying to sell goods in that market, and they were being invited in by the Japanese, and they're all flapping around on the deck like fish out of the tank. They're just dying. They couldn't make it in the Japanese market because of that whole keiretsu notion. Now that's changed a lot, but still is an example of a way that countries can use a non-tariff barrier to protect trade within its own borders. Now there's one organization that I want to talk about, worldwide organization, that I want to talk to you all about, and I want you all to know about for the exam. Now that's the World Trade Organization. It's also called the WTO. You'll see it abbreviated WTO. What started out as the GATT, which is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, in 1948, it gained momentum over the years, and then it evolved into the World Trade Organization in 1986. And you won't need to know dates or anything like that, but I'm just saying, I think it's important, though, to understand that the GATT evolved into the World Trade Organization, because you'll hear GATT a lot when you start talking about global business, and it's just referring to periods of time or agreements or whatever that were made a very long time ago, back in the 40s. Okay, so that's important to just understand that the GATT became the World Trade Organization as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, as it grew and gained momentum from other nations who wanted to join. They got together and formed an actual organization. So what started out as just an agreement ended up becoming an organization unto itself, and that's how the World Trade Organization came to be. Okay, WTO is headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. A wonderful place to visit, and strategically picked because Switzerland is neutral. It's always been neutral. Its competitive advantage is that it is a neutral country, and so they headquarter lots of stuff in Geneva, Switzerland, because it's supposed to be this amazingly neutral ground. Which little sidebar, from visiting Switzerland and driving around in that country, you wouldn't know that they were so neutral, because they have hidden bunkers and stuff all over. And once you recognize what one of them looks like, you'll see. I'm pretty sure that if the entire world were to go into nuclear war, that the Swiss would probably be the only ones still alive. Because once you recognize what the bunkers look like, you see them all over in the hills and mountains in Switzerland. So anyway, little sidebar there. Switzerland is neutral, but they're prepared for the entire world to blow each other up. There are 152 member nations to the World Trade Organization. And the World Trade Organization oversees border trade issues and global business practices. Now I want to talk to you about NAFTA. Being that we live in North America, we live in the U.S., you will hear a lot about NAFTA. And I want all of my students to be familiar with NAFTA, because it's likely to be something that will come up again and again and again, and you'll have a clue of what they're talking about. NAFTA was ratified in 1994, and it created a free trade zone, not a trade free. that would be no trade. No, it created free trade zone in North America, and it eliminated all barriers of trade between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. NAFTA is still a super hot topic today. And the reason it's a hot topic is that although trade has risen from $289 billion to $930 billion following NAFTA, the hot button is that an estimated 500,000 manufacturing jobs have been lost to Mexico. Now, I'll offer a little sidebar in there. I don't think that NAFTA is entirely to blame for that, because I think that Americans would lose manufacturing jobs because we keep raising minimum wage. And when we raise minimum wage, I mean, it's kind of a, it's a catch-22. People can't afford to live in your own country, so you raise minimum wage so that people can make more. But then businesses look at that and say, I can pay an American, $7.30 or whatever minimum wage is now. I think it just is going. I think it's even going up again. But you get the gist. You could either pay the American the minimum wage, or you could go to Cambodia and you could pay somebody $1 a day, and they'd be happy as a pig in mud to get that much money, because that's more than they could make in any other legitimate work that they do over there. Or you can pay the American $7 an hour. I mean, it's just kind of like, but then we see this 500,000 number being lost to Mexico, and we think that, and a lot of people are going to blame NAFTA for that. I don't entirely subscribe to that. I think that it's convenient. Okay, Mexico is right there, so it's convenient without any trade barriers. Then if they manufacture it in Mexico, they can import it to the U.S. and not pay any tariffs or face quotas or anything like that. So there's an advantage being that it's right there in Mexico. And transportation costs are less too, because it's right there. So, but anyway, I don't think that it's entirely NAFTA's fault that 500,000 manufacturing jobs were lost. I think that would have happened anyway in the global market. But nevertheless, I want you to know, NAFTA is still a hot topic. Trade's risen as a result of NAFTA. And, consequently, a whole lot more manufacturing is going on over in Mexico now than it was. I think the book points out it's got one of those yellow boxes. And once again, I've done a miserable job at keeping up with my lecture in the textbook, but there's a box somewhere, and it talks about U.S. trade partners. Interestingly enough, Canada is our biggest trade partner. So we trade the most stuff to Canada. I think we probably make it in Mexico, bring it into the U.S., and then sell it to Canada. So anyway, they're one of our biggest trade partners. I mean, it's only natural that Canada would be a huge trade partner, because it's so cold up there. You can't make anything except snow cones or something. You couldn't really produce anything. It would be hard. You can't grow anything. I mean, it's just tough. So Canada is going to be one of those countries that they're going to have to import a whole lot of stuff, because they lack the warmth to really do anything on their own. So anyway, this is an interesting aside, though, because we trade an awful lot with Canada. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the future of global trade. China's on the move. Okay, within recent times, it's attracted way more foreign direct investment. And I know we didn't talk in depth about foreign direct investment, but remember on that slide where it had the continuum, right? I'm going to go back to that slide real quick. Foreign direct investment, down here at the bottom, represents the most risk, but the biggest profit potential. And, here we have China attracting more foreign direct investment than the U.S. Very interesting. That's kind of an eyebrow-raising thing. Here's something to think about. If car ownership ever became as common in China as it is in the U.S., there'd be 600 million cars in China, which is more than there are in the entire world right now. If the car, that would just be in China. Okay, now, I've got to see a couple, that next big bullet down there. India can't be far behind. India is not far behind that. Okay, but I'm not going to jump down there just yet. Let's talk about China. Green. In China, green is a priority. It was amazing to me when I was over there how the focus on China is on sustainability and the green initiative. However, China has an aging population. Because of the two-child rule that they've had for quite some time, that has slowed the population growth in China to a point where that whole country is rapidly aging. Now, I say India can't be far behind. Now we're ready to talk about that. The population of India, on the other hand, is getting younger and larger. Because in India, they're starting to now, when I was in Mumbai, was it last year? They have billboards up all over the place now about contraceptives and family planning. And, it's not uncommon, though, to see an Indian family with 10 children. And that's dramatically shaping the future of that country. Now, there's a huge market in India, but the primary barrier is that there's tough trade laws, and the Indian, it's hard to even wrap your mind around some of the regulations that they have as far as doing business in that country. And so that's the biggest thing, that if they opened their markets, that it would be huge for businesses. And I mean, businesses still do business in India, but it is more difficult. Okay, and there's a third mover I'm going to put on there, and that's Brazil. Brazil has biodiesel and ethanol expertise that it's been developing since the 1980s. They're the world's experts in biodiesel. I think they're the biggest exporters of biodiesel. And it's because they can grow sugar cane down there. Like, all over the place. Sugar cane grows like weeds down there. And, well, I won't get too much into but there's questionable practices about how they harvest the sugar cane and how they dispose of the biodiesel waste products. But, then there's this thing they just found in the news. It was all over the place. Brazil's just found the biggest oil reservoir ever. More oil than's ever been found in one place on Earth is off the shore of Brazil, underneath the ocean. And they're going to start tapping that. As long as we still are oil dependent, and I'll offer a little sidebar there, as China gets to have more cars than there are in the entire world, the world's demand for oil is going to go up. And so, anyway, Brazil, you can't deny, is going to be huge in the future. And we're going to close the lecture today on offshore outsourcing, which is something that I know all of us have heard of, and we probably all think about it as a really negative consequence. But there are some positive aspects to it. First of all, from a strategic point of view, a business can outsource its less strategic tasks globally so that it can focus on the things it needs to do that it excels at, and so it can focus on doing that and growing. Outsourced work allows companies to create efficiencies and in turn hire more workers. Does that sound counterintuitive? Well, I have an example. A firm that my dad worked for outsourced architectural drawings to Brazil. And as a result, they saved enough to hire 2 more project managers instead of hiring an architect. Now, that's pretty good news if you're a project manager, and I guess that it's probably pretty bad news if you're an architect. But I'm saying that's an example of where allowing the company to focus on its efficiencies in turn allowed them to hire more workers, because they hired 2 people. Instead of hiring 1 architect, they hired 2 project managers. Okay, another pro is that consumers benefit from low prices. Everybody likes to pay less. That's bottom line. Doesn't matter what country you live in. People want to pay less. And the final pro is that it allows developing nations to grow, because you're helping their economy by outsourcing the stuff that would be too expensive to do and is not part of your core focus. Okay, so some of the negative pieces, I'm sure you all know this down cold. The cons, well, jobs are lost permanently and wages fall. Because if a company knows that it can outsource manufacturing to China or Vietnam and pay the workers there a lot less, then that may cause wages to fall in this country, because suddenly people say, well, you know, I'd be willing to take half of what you normally would pay me if you just keep it here. You know, so anyway, and then that can cause wages to fall and jobs to be lost permanently. Another con, offshore outsourcing can lower product quality, therefore damaging a company's reputation. So that's definitely a negative thing to say about outsourcing, is that you lose total control, and it reflects on your company sometimes. Let's take, for example, call centers. I mean, we've all encountered calling a company and the person who answers is clearly in another country, and that's you lose control over the quality of what's going on in your call center by outsourcing it to a company who doesn't know anything about your company or the country that you operate in. So anyway, another example, all the products, you know, that are manufactured in China. You outsource the production to China, and you go over and you make these wonderful contracts. Well, there's a book, and this goes into the next bullet too, where communication becomes much more difficult. Well, Poorly Made in China is a book that is filled with hysterical communication examples and loss of quality by outsourcing to manufacturers in China. And it specifically focuses on China because it's called Poorly Made in China. And this guy basically went undercover and went around to all these different contract manufacturers in China, and the book is amazing. It's an eye-opener. But one example he gave is a story about how 25,000 pairs of shoes came back with a peg protruding from the left foot, because in the foot of the left shoe, because the company who sent the example to the manufacturing company in China, forgot to mention that, hey, the peg sticking out of the bottom of the left foot is so that we can hang it on the wall at the store. And they ended up with 25,000 pairs of shoes that had a peg coming out of the bottom of the left foot. And that, my friends, is a communication problem. And that is a con of outsourcing. So there we have it. We're going to leave the lecture there and review this. Take close attention to anything that I talked about. Look it over in the book. Take notes. And review this presentation if you need to. And let me know, email, or chat if you have any questions.